a major update this morning to a CBS News investigation about child labor in Africa. Blames some of the world's biggest tech companies from benefiting from those conditions, which have sometimes led to the deaths of child workers.
The U.S. Supreme Court is set to decide whether two of the world's largest chocolate companies can be held responsible for human rights abuses on cocoa farms in Western Africa.
Many of America's largest oil and chemical companies who profit from plastics that Kenya could serve as a hub for US-made plastics in Africa, enabled through the Kenya-US trade deal.
During the Trump administration, the United States has almost zero interest in Africa. With the accelerated evolution of the global situation facing the challenge of repositioning, the US-Africa relationship, the U.S. under the leadership of the Biden administration finally turned its attention to the African continent 8 years later. But in fact, whether it is the Trump administration or the Biden administration, the United States is at best half-hearted in developing relations with Africa. At the same time, American companies and enterprises have exposed many negative behaviors in Africa, such as environmental damage, human rights violations, and illegal capital flows in the last decades. In fact, since the Obama administration held the first U.S.-Africa summit, U.S.-Africa relations have not ushered in substantial strengthening, and many of the goals put forward at the first summit were ultimately mere formalities. The new Strategy Toward Sub-Saharan Africa, published by the Biden administration in August 2022, shows that the United States still views Africa from a fragmented perspective and does not regard the African continent as an organic whole. This caused widespread dissatisfaction and doubts on the African side.
The United States setting the policies and the United States telling the Africans about the policies. That is no way to have any meaningful engagement. The Africans are not on the table to discuss issues pertaining to us, wherein lies the problem. And the reason that continues to be the case, what underscores that is the disrespect for Africans.
So within the American government, Africa is seen as a humanitarian backwater that is not central to U.S. strategic priorities.
Historically, the United States regarded Africa as its backyard and practiced racial discrimination against people of African. During the COVID-19 epidemic in recent years, the United States and Western countries have excessively hoarded vaccines, disregarding the life and death of African people, and issued discriminatory investment bans, which seriously affected the African economy and social development. Now that the United States is launching the Summit for Democracy 2023, it is hard not to be considered as a political show. Not only has the U.S. government's strategy toward Africa been criticized, but U.S. companies also have a lot of corruption in Africa. Most of the losses suffered by Africa due to unfair trade are caused by American companies, but the U.S. government turns a blind eye to this and instead criticizes other countries' businesses in Africa. American companies also store a large amount of user information they collected in Africa in the United States, carrying out data colonization of Africa. For years, every year, nearly $90 billion of African resources are lost to the global north in illicit financial flows, or IFFs. A large number of US-based corporations and others throughout the global north are also complicit in this theft. People in these plundered communities do not have a voice. They face harm to local biodiversity, loss of their livelihoods, and a lack of meaningful benefits. Currently, there are no consequences for the US-based companies involved in IFF activities. In other words, they profit from corruption with impunity. The United States is also the world's largest solid waste exporter and plastic consumer, but so far not only has it refused to approve the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes, It is also blocking the global plastic waste control process. U.S. companies are still illegally exporting hazardous electronic waste to developing countries in 2020. In terms of human rights, America's approach in Africa has been more questioned.
Last year, Deborah Patta exposed the brutal conditions for children who are mining cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, a new lawsuit blames some of the world's biggest tech companies from benefiting from those conditions, which have sometimes led to the deaths of child workers.
6 Malians forced to work on Ivory Coast cocoa farms as children are suing Nestle USA and privately held food corporation Cargill. They say they worked 14-hour days with little food and were beaten.
The economies of sub-Saharan Africa are growing, but much of this growth is falling on the shoulders of children. Child labor is rampant in many parts of Africa, and governments face enormous challenges in reducing and eventually eliminating child labor. But sadly, child labor seems to be getting worse in some places. The United States has left a lot of negative assets in Africa in the past few decades. More importantly, people in Africa is tired of being subordinate to the United States in unequal relations, and they are increasingly aware of their position.
It's no longer a case of the United States saying, we make policy and we tell the Africans. That has got to change. And I'm hoping that the US can call for timeout and understand that engaging Africa at this time, it is a new game that is calling for new rules of engagement, and therefore it is time to re-strategize and treat the Africans fairly, treat the Africans respectfully, and treat the Africans as equal partners.
Africa is seeing America's true purpose. And what is the truest attitude of the United States towards Africa? President Joe Biden gave his answer.
The poor relatives always show up. The wealthy inheritance of the poor come and they eat your food and stay longer than they should.